May 29, 1983, U.S. Festival, Glen Helen Regional Park, California. The desert sun was setting behind the San Bernardino Mountains when Eddie Van Halen cornered Francis Buchholz in the equipment trailer that served as Scorpion's makeshift dressing room. Outside, 375,000 people were settling in for Heavy Metal Sunday, but inside that cramped space, two very different philosophies of rock music were about to collide in the most unexpected way. "So you're the silent one," Eddie said, his Frankenstrat guitar still strapped across his shoulder, sweat from Van Halen's blistering set still glistening on his forehead. Germany's secret weapon. His voice carried that particular combination of California confidence and barely controlled energy that had made him the most talked-about guitarist in the world. Francis looked up from tuning his Fender Precision bass, his engineer's mind automatically noting the perfect intonation in Eddie's voice despite the obvious adrenaline rush. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark. Eddie, 28 years old, was rock royalty in leather pants and a striped shirt, his hair wild from 90 minutes of athletic stage performance. Francis, 29, sat quietly in his simple black stage clothes, methodically checking his equipment with the precision that had earned him a reputation as the most reliable bassist in hard rock. Where Eddie commanded attention, Francis absorbed it. Where Eddie exploded with kinetic energy, Francis provided the gravitational force that kept everything in orbit. "I heard your set," Francis said in his careful English, his slight German accent adding weight to each word. Clean technique, very impressive. The compliment was genuine but delivered with the understated manner that had become his trademark. In the world of rock excess, Francis Buchholz was an anomaly, a man who spoke through his instrument rather than his ego. Eddie's grin widened, but there was something predatory in it. The festival had been a showcase for guitar virtuosity, with Eddie and his contemporaries pushing the boundaries of what 6 strings could do. Randy Rhoads had proven himself with Ozzy. Joe Satriani was emerging. Yngwie Malmsteen was making noise in Sweden. It was an arms race of technical ability, and Eddie Van Halen was determined to remain king of the mountain. "Here's what I'm thinking," Eddie said, dropping onto a road case and pulling his guitar into position. "Everyone knows Eruption. Everyone knows that solo defined what guitar could be in the 80s. But here's my question for you, Germany's quiet genius." He paused, his fingers unconsciously finding the familiar positions for the opening tapped harmonics. "Can you play Eruption on bass?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the pyrotechnics outside. Francis's fingers stopped moving on the tuning pegs. Around them, the usual backstage chaos continued, roadies moving equipment, band members grabbing beer and towels, but in their corner of the trailer, time seemed suspended. Eddie wasn't just asking about technical ability. This was a challenge to everything Francis represented, a suggestion that his steady, foundational approach to the instrument was somehow less than the flashy heroics that had made guitar solos the centerpiece of rock performance. "I mean," Eddie continued, warming to his theme, "everyone talks about bass as the foundation, the rhythm section, the invisible glue, but what happens when you take away all the hiding? What happens when you put bass in the spotlight the same way guitar lives there every night?" His fingers began the opening sequence of tapped harmonics, the notes floating through the air even without amplification. Or maybe German engineering doesn't do improvisation. That last comment was the spark that ignited something in Francis's usually calm demeanor. Not anger exactly, but a quiet determination that his Scorpions bandmates would have recognized immediately. It was the same expression he wore when working out a particularly complex bass line, when other musicians told him it couldn't be done, when producers suggested simplifying his arrangements for radio play. The look of an engineer who had just been presented with an interesting problem to solve. "Hand me your guitar," Francis said quietly. Eddie's eyebrows shot up. "What?"
"Your Frankenstrat."
"Let me borrow it for a moment." Francis set down his bass and extended his hand. "If we're going to do this properly, I should understand what you're working with." The request was so unexpected that Eddie actually hesitated. The red, white, and black Frankenstrat was his baby, a custom instrument he'd built himself, modified and refined until it was an extension of his own nervous system. Musicians didn't just hand over their primary instruments to strangers, especially not at the most important rock festival of the decade. But something in Francis's manner, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from his stillness, made Eddie reconsider. Maybe it was curiosity about what the German would do. Maybe it was professional respect for someone who'd held down the low end for one of Europe's biggest rock exports. Or maybe it was simple fascination with someone so different from himself. Eddie unstrapped the guitar and handed it over. "Don't break it," Francis accepted the instrument with the reverence of an engineer handling precision equipment. His first move wasn't to play it, but to examine it. He studied the pickup configuration, tested the action on the neck, checked the tuning stability of Eddie's custom tremolo system. His hands moved over the guitar like a diagnostic scan, understanding its capabilities before attempting to use them. "Fascinating," Francis murmured, more to himself than to Eddie. "The pickup placement creates interesting harmonic possibilities in the mid-range. In this tremolo system, you've modified the springs to increase return tension." He looked up at Eddie with something approaching professional admiration. "Very clever." "Yeah, well," Eddie said, suddenly feeling like a student explaining his homework to a professor. "I needed something that could handle dive bombs without going out of tune." Francis nodded thoughtfully and settled the guitar across his lap, but instead of sitting normally, he positioned himself with the guitar flat, like a lap steel. Eddie was about to ask what he was doing when Francis's right hand began moving across the strings in a pattern that made Eddie's breath catch in his throat. The opening of Eruption began to emerge from the guitar, but not as Eddie had ever heard it. Francis was playing it as if the guitar were a bass, using his thumb and fingers to create a percussive attack that turned Eddie's flashy tapped harmonics into something that sounded like it was being played by a rhythm section rather than a lead instrument. The notes were the same, but the feel was completely different. Where Eddie's version was all about speed and technical display, Francis's interpretation emphasized the groove, the pocket, the spaces between the notes that made the fast parts meaningful. But that was just the beginning. As Francis warmed up to the instrument, he began to adapt the solo in real time, playing Eddie's signature phrases but reimagining them through a bassist's perspective. The famous ascending run became a walking bass line that somehow covered the same melodic ground while implying a completely different harmonic foundation. The tremolo dives turned into pitch bends that sounded like a bass guitar stretching the fundamental frequency of the entire song. Most shocking of all, Francis was making it groove. Eddie's Eruption was a showcase of individual virtuosity, a moment for the guitarist to step outside the band context and display pure technical ability. But Francis's version was turning it into something that made you want to move, something that implied a whole rhythm section even though it was just one man playing one instrument. Eddie found himself unconsciously nodding his head to rhythms he'd never noticed in his own composition. "How are you doing that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over Francis's playing. Francis didn't answer immediately. He was deep in the zone that every musician recognizes, the place where technical ability becomes secondary to pure musical expression. His fingers were finding patterns on Eddie's guitar that Eddie himself had never explored, not because Francis was more technically proficient, but because he was approaching the instrument from a completely different philosophical foundation. When Francis finally finished, bringing the piece to a conclusion with a final tremolo dive that somehow sounded both dramatic and perfectly resolved, the trailer had gone completely quiet. Other musicians who had drifted over to listen were staring at the quiet German bassist who had just turned the most famous guitar solo of the decade into something that sounded like it belonged in a completely different universe. Eddie stared at his own instrument in Francis's hands as if seeing it for the first time. "That was," he started, then stopped, apparently lacking words for what he'd just witnessed. "Different," Francis suggested, handing the guitar back with the same careful respect with which he'd received it. "That was impossible," Eddie said, but his voice carried more admiration than disbelief. "How did you make my guitar sound like a bass section?" Francis shrugged with characteristic understatement. "In engineering, we call it thinking about function rather than form. Your solo is very impressive technically, but when I hear it, I don't think about how fast you can play. I think about what foundation those notes need to really sing." He picked up his own bass and settled it into position. "The spotlight is nice, but most music happens in the shadows." Eddie was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd just experienced. As a guitarist, he was used to being the center of attention, the focal point of musical arrangements. But Francis had just shown him something he'd never considered, that there were other ways to think about musical leadership, other ways to be essential to a song without being its most obvious element. "Can you show me something?" Eddie asked, his voice lacking its earlier edge of challenge. "I mean, not Eruption exactly, but how do you think about building a song from the bottom up?" What happened next was one of the most unusual masterclasses in rock history. For the next hour, while other bands prepared for their sets and the festival continued outside, Eddie Van Halen and Francis Buchholz engaged in a musical conversation that neither of them would ever forget. Francis showed Eddie how he constructed bass lines that could drive an entire arrangement while remaining virtually invisible to casual listeners. He demonstrated the difference between playing fast and playing effectively, between technical display and musical service. Most importantly, he shared his perspective on how rhythm section players could be leaders without being leaders, essential without being obvious. Eddie, for his part, showed Francis techniques for making single notes speak with more authority, ways to use the guitar's upper register to add harmonic color to bass lines. They traded ideas about timing, about space, about the difference between playing a lot of notes and saying something important with a few carefully chosen ones. "You know what's funny?" Eddie said as they finally began packing up their instruments. Outside, they could hear Ozzy Osbourne taking the stage for his headlining set. "I've been thinking about guitar as this competitive thing, like there's only room for one person to be the best. But talking to you, it's like there are completely different games being played on the same field." Francis smiled. "In Germany, we have an expression. The best machine is the one you never notice working. Your guitar playing, it's like a sports car. Very exciting, very impressive. Bass playing, it's like the transmission. Not as flashy, but without it, even the best engine goes nowhere." "That's not a put-down of what I do?" "Not at all," Francis replied, shouldering his bass case. "Sports cars are wonderful, but someone has to build the roads they drive on." Eddie laughed, a sound that contained more genuine appreciation than any of his stage banter. "You know, Francis, I think I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been so focused on being the fastest gun in the West that I forgot about building the town." As they prepared to leave the trailer, Eddie hesitated. "Listen, I know this is going to sound weird, but would you be interested in staying in touch? I mean, not collaborating or anything official, but I think I could learn some things from the way you think about music." Francis considered this for a moment. Eddie Van Halen was asking to learn from him, the quiet bassist from Germany, who had never sought the spotlight, never claimed to be anything more than a craftsman in service to the song. It was the kind of recognition that meant more than any magazine cover or guitar solo contest victory. "I would like that," Francis said simply. Over the years that followed, Eddie and Francis maintained an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect and complementary musical philosophies. They never collaborated publicly, never made a big show of their connection, but musicians in their circles knew that Eddie had started thinking differently about rhythm and foundation after that conversation at US Festival, that his guitar playing had gained a more sophisticated sense of space and timing. Francis, for his part, had learned something equally valuable from Eddie's approach to the instrument. Not the flashy technique, but the fearlessness, the willingness to put music in places where it had never been before. That lesson would serve him well in the years to come, as Scorpions reached their commercial peak and Francis found himself having to balance artistic integrity with massive commercial success. The story of that night became legendary in certain musical circles, though neither Eddie nor Francis ever spoke about it publicly. It was a private moment of mutual recognition between two masters of their craft, a reminder that excellence comes in many forms, and that the most important conversations in music often happen away from the spotlight. Years later, after Eddie's death in 2020, Francis would remember that night at US Festival as a turning point in his understanding of what it meant to be a musician rather than just a bass player. Eddie had challenged him to step outside his comfort zone, and in doing so had helped him discover new dimensions of his own artistry. "He taught me that respect comes in many forms," Francis said in a rare interview about their friendship. "Sometimes the greatest compliment is someone taking the time to really listen to what you're not saying as much as what you are." The quiet German and the flashy Californian had found common ground in their shared dedication to the craft, their willingness to learn from each other despite their different approaches. In a music industry often driven by ego and competition, their friendship stood as a reminder that the best musicians are students first, masters second. And somewhere in the shadows of rock history, the echo of Francis Buchholz playing Eruption on Eddie Van Halen's guitar continued to resonate, a moment when two different philosophies of music making found perfect harmony in the most unexpected of places.